Hello, my name is Konstantina Georgiou and I am Communication Officer for the PolyCIVIS project. Welcome to the PolyCIVIS podcast series of CIVIS. In this series, experts from diverse disciplines come together to delve into the complexities of the polycrisis and its implications for research, policy, and education. In this episode, we will be talking with Sophia Papaioannou, Professor of Latin Literature, Vice-Rector for Academic Affairs, International Relations and Extroversion, and CIVIS Scientific Coordinator at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, to discuss on eventual liaisons of polycrisis between climate change, archaeological monuments, and cultural heritage. The interview is taken by Associate Professor Dimitris Gouscos, PolyCIVIS Communication and Dissemination Work Package co-leader from the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. Dear Professor Papaioannou and Professor Gouscos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, dear Konstantina. Dear Professor Papaioannou, it is a real pleasure having you with us today for this podcast. Could you give us some more information on the ways in which climate changes might affect archaeological monuments?
Thank you, first of all, Professor Gouscos, for inviting me to be part of this important discussion. The polycrisis refers to a confluence of interconnected phenomena of crisis that are compounding each other in ways that make them more difficult to address. Let me, though, identify some ways in which climate change can have significant impact on archaeological monuments and heritage sites. First and foremost, with climate change, we have a rise in sea levels, which causes coastal erosions. Many archaeological monuments are located near coastlines. Rise in sea levels can cause increased erosion, leading to the destruction or submersion of these sites. Then, we have storms and flooding, extreme weather events that we did not used to have in decades past, especially in Greece. Severe storms, hurricanes, you remember last year in Thessaly, and heavy rainfall can cause flooding and water damage to monuments. In regions where flooding is frequent, archaeological layers may be washed away, or standing water may cause structural weaknesses in the foundations of these monuments. Then, temperature fluctuations, especially heat. Thermal stress is very intense. The heat waves in recent years can create thermal stress in stone monuments, especially those we have in Greece. Over time, the expansion and contraction caused by heat can result in cracking and eventual degradation of structures. The desertification phenomenon, a part of the crisis that affects truly the African countries. As deserts expand and vegetation declines, exposed monuments may face increased wind erosion. Sand dunes can migrate, covering monuments or eroding them with abrasive sand particles. And as I said, this is particularly an issue regarding the regions like North Africa and the Middle East. In the northern parts of Europe, Scandinavia, they have a problem with glacier melting. As glaciers melt due to rising global temperatures, ancient artifacts that were preserved in ice for thousands of years are being exposed. While this presents opportunities for archaeological discoveries, it also means that once artifacts are exposed to air and moisture, they can rapidly deteriorate unless properly conserved. Then warmer temperatures and change in participation patterns can lead to the growth of vegetation on monuments like algae and lichens. And these changes in biodiversity accelerate the deterioration of materials such as stone, brick, or mortar. And finally, air pollution. Those of us older in Greece remember the smog in the 1980s and the damage that it caused to the Acropolis and how much money was spent trying to restore and remove acid rain from the Parthenon. In regions where climate change is coupled with industrial activities, and this is very much a case in those parts of Africa where where the rules for the preservation of health regulations are not observed very, very strictly, the increase in pollutants can lead to acid rain, which accelerates the decay of limestone, marble, and other building materials. Finally, human intervention can also cause damage as much as it can prevent and mitigate climate change. Let's talk about mitigate, how human effort can mitigate climate change by constructing seawalls, dams, and other infrastructure, which, however, may intentionally harm archaeological sites. For example, we face a shortage of water in recent years because, of course, it does not rain as much as it used to in decades past in the Mediterranean. And efforts to redirect water to prevent flooding or conduce water to big cities that don't have enough supply may alter the hydrology of the area and destabilize foundations of archaeological monuments that may lie nearby. I believe that the impacts of climate change on archaeological monuments are diverse and potentially devastating, as I have already discussed. But I hope that protective conservation efforts can mitigate some of the worst effects.
Thank you very much, Professor Papaioannou, for your elaboration on this. Thank you especially for starting by framing so nicely how archaeological monuments might be endangered by the broader agenda of the polycrisis. In my view, there are very interesting issues coming out here, like the potential victimization of archaeological monuments from war or from financial difficulties and from crises in other domains as well. But then coming back again to the more focused domain of our podcast on climate change, and with thanks for those so vivid and diverse examples that you gave us, I wonder if those adverse effects of climate change might extend not only to archaeological monuments, but somewhat broader to what we call cultural heritage, and at least the tangible part of cultural heritage in a more general way. And perhaps if you might see any potential impacts to what we call intangible cultural heritage.
Starting with the tangible cultural heritage, rising sea levels threaten coastal heritage sites. Everybody knows nowadays the situation of Venice. The level of the sea has risen in recent years, and extreme rain causes flooding. 2 to 3 times a year, Venice floods. And Venice is one of the most ancient cities in Italy, with treasures, monuments that have been declared UNESCO protected sites, and these are in danger of being destroyed because of the rise in sea levels. Then extreme weather events like hurricanes, floods, and wildfires can directly damage or destroy heritage sites, such as places like in New Orleans. I was in the US when Hurricane Katrina hit the southern part of the United States, and the historical quarter of New Orleans that goes back to the 17th century, one of the most ancient parts of the United States, was completely flooded and destroyed. So the identity of the Creole culture and the Hispanic culture of North America suffered irreversible damage due to a hurricane. Moving on to the intangible heritage. Of course, intangible heritage includes languages, cultures, practices, knowledge systems that are passed down from generation to generation, especially in cultures that for a long time survived in communities where knowledge passed from memory and orally without writing systems. Here, climate change can also affect these communities profoundly. First and foremost, we have the loss of traditional livelihoods. With the appearance of droughts, phenomena like drought or floods can disrupt traditional farming, fishing, and herding practices, leading to the erosion of cultural knowledge tied to these activities. Whole communities living in sites that have been flooded and they cannot be retrieved are forced to migrate. And this migration is leading to the loss of local customs, festivals, and oral traditions tied to specific places. Then changes in seasonal patterns are very important for these communities and the preservation of intangible cultural heritage, because indigenous knowledge systems often rely on predictable weather patterns for practices like planting, harvesting, and various rituals. Climate shifts disrupt these patterns, leading to the decline of culturally important practices. And finally, these displaced communities or communities that are forced to scatter, diaspora communities, eventually after a generation or two lose their language. So many indigenous languages have been lost, especially those that do not have a writing system, have been lost due to changes in the climate of these areas that force the people to migrate. Overall, while tangible heritage may suffer from more visible and immediate damage, intangible cultural heritage is also at significant risk, especially as climate change disrupts ecosystem and social structures that underpin cultural practices.
Thank you very much, Professor Papaioannou, for these most thoughtful insights, let me say. I am particularly impressed myself to hear from you in how many not so evident ways, actually, even intangible cultural heritage might be impacted by the climate change crisis. Would you think that it might be possible that some opposite liaisons and chains of consequences might come into play as well? Would you think, for instance, that any current crisis in cultural heritage itself might themselves have a potential affecting climate change?
Oh, yes, of course. Crises in the domain of cultural heritage can have huge potential to affect climate change, though sometimes the relationship may not always be immediately apparent. First of all, the destruction of cultural sites and sustainable practices. Many traditional culture and heritage sites are centers of sustainable environmental practices that have been honed over generations. The destruction of these sites, whether through conflict, urbanization, or natural disasters like flooding or extreme heat, can lead to the loss of knowledge and systems for managing resource sustainability. This destruction, for instance, of ancient irrigation systems or sustainable agricultural practices could result in land degradation, which can exacerbate, in turn, a climate change by reducing carbon sequestration. Secondly, loss of indigenous knowledge. We just mentioned in our discussion of intangible cultural heritage that indigenous communities often hold crucial ecological knowledge and practices that help preserve biodiversity and manage ecosystems sustainably. When these communities are displaced because of climate change and extreme weather phenomena, their cultural practices are marginalized at best or disappear, as it is usually the case after a generation or two. Then another important phenomenon is wars, conflict overall, and the inevitable displacement that follows these conflicts. You know, we have the war in Ukraine in the past few years. And all of us who are engaged with the study of antiquity are aware of serious damage that has happened to Byzantine monasteries in the Ukraine after a sustained bombing. This damage is irreversible. Armed conflicts in general often threaten cultural heritage sites and lead to mass displacements of population. Refugees or displaced communities may be forced to settle in fragile ecosystems, potentially leading to overexploitation of resources like forests, water, or arable land. Then tourism is another thing that threatens the ecosystems and is directly and tightly associated with climate change and the preservation of cultural heritage. Cultural heritage often is a pole of attraction for tourists. And crisis in heritage sites can sometimes lead to intensified tourism in other areas, contributing to carbon emissions from increased travel. You know, a word that is very much in use in fashion these past few years is over-tourism. How many tourists are enough? Especially for locations that cannot accommodate comfortably huge amounts of people. Urbanization and overdevelopment is another means by which cultural heritages and climate change interact and the one affects the other. People often are in a rush to modernize, especially in the developing world. And historical urban areas may be replaced with unsustainable developments, leading to increased carbon footprints. Loss of heritage structures often correlates with unsustainable resource-intensive construction practices. In short, crises affecting cultural heritage can undermine sustainable environmental practices, drive deforestation or land degradation, and overall lead to damage that cannot be reversed.
Thank you so much, Professor Papaioannou, for these thoughts. And here again, I think it is impressive, as sad as it may seem, it is impressive how clear this sort of vicious circle between climate crisis impacts to cultural heritage and then impacts back to the climate crisis can actually be operating. Would you think that these topics that we are discussing about could also be viewed from a continent lens? What I mean is, in your discussion, you have already mentioned examples from all parts of Europe, from Africa, so clearly these are problems that appear all around the world. But then, what I wonder is, given the globality of those problems, is there room for some coordinated know-how exchange between Europe and Africa, or for some common action taking?
Right, this is a very good question. Of course, Europe and Africa have different types of sites and cultural experiences, different type of cultural heritage, but also they are faced by different expressions of climate change. Both Europe and Africa, first of all, can share strategies on adaptive measures for protecting heritage sites against climate risks. For instance, Africa's traditional bioclimatic architecture, buildings designed with local climates in mind, very hot climates, could offer insights into low-tech, sustainable methods of heritage preservation for Europe, especially in recent years when the climate, the temperatures have risen and several parts of Southern Europe, especially including Greece and Italy, have come to experience desert-like climates. Then both Europe and Africa could explore how cultural heritage can be part of a broader sustainability effort system. In Africa, many traditional practices have long included sustainable agriculture and water management techniques, which could inform contemporary climate adaptation strategies in Europe. Similarly, Europe's focus on sustainable tourism tied to cultural heritage sites could offer valuable insights for African nations looking to preserve heritage while promoting eco-friendly tourism. Cultural diplomacy, a term very much in fashion these days, can be used as a means of fostering international cooperation between Europe and Africa. Cross-continent initiatives like UNESCO-led projects could provide platforms for exchange in knowledge on best practices in heritage preservation.
Thank you very much, Professor Papaioannou, for these views. And thank you especially for bringing forward into your answer not only the potential of higher technology, so to say, to help by replacing lower technology, but also the opposite, how low-tech could actually prove a better solution to polycrisis situations than high-tech. I think this is quite an interesting point that it would be nice to further explore in some future opportunity. Now, as we are coming toward the final part of our podcast, please let me try to introduce one more aspect in our discussion. Given the multitude of different ways in which climate change might have some adverse effects on cultural heritage, like those that you mentioned already, would you think that there might be some gender lens or some youth lens that we should apply when looking at the polycrisis liaisons between climate change and cultural heritage that seem to come forward in our discussion?
Well, there is no crisis without a gender or a youth lens, in my opinion. Let me start with the gender lens, which reveals the distinct ways in which crises affect women and men differently, often deepening existing inequalities. Women and girls, first and foremost, are more vulnerable to the effects of economic downturns, climate change, conflicts, or health crises due to pre-existing structural inequalities in lower economic participation, unpaid care responsibilities, and less access to resources. For instance, during climate-related crises, women in many regions often bear the burden of providing for food. They are most affected by food insecurity. And in conflict zones, sexual and gender-based violence often escalates, disproportionately affecting women and girls. Then, during health crises like COVID, the COVID pandemic most recently, women were those who disproportionately bore the weight of handling the crisis. You remember that schools were out, little kids were tutored at home by video, by Zoom distance learning technology, and the mothers were those that mostly had to be there all the time, attend to the kids, pay attention and make sure that the kids properly do their housework, or at least don't stay too much behind in their activities. And this, of course, had a direct effect to the mother's own work performance. Less time for themselves, more time for the kids, while the fathers were not as much involved, at least in the majority. Then women are often underrepresented in leadership roles, where decisions about crisis response and recovery are made, leading to responses that may not fully account for their needs and experiences. As far as younger people and the effect of the crisis on themselves, first of all, there is an indubitable economic impact. Youth unemployment is often higher than for other age groups, and economic crisis can have lasting effects on their careers. To get back to the COVID pandemic, disrupted education and career opportunities for millions of young people. How many people planned to go abroad for a graduate degree or a job or an internship, and they had to pause their plans because of the pandemic. Then a lot of young people developed mental health problems during the COVID pandemic. And young people in general are vulnerable to mental health issues during crisis due to the increased uncertainty about their futures, disruptions to education, and of course, a social isolation. We're still dealing with the consequences of the COVID isolation, the lockdowns, and a lot of psychologists believe that the increased violence in younger people today is an outcome directly connected to their isolation during the COVID pandemic. Climate change. Young people are at the forefront of climate activism because they are the generation that will live through the worst impacts of climate change. It is because of the younger people that a lot of movements across the globe have taken strides and brought to the fore the emergency to address the climate change issues. And of course, politics. Younger people are more politically active and are less restrained to express their views, and they have strong views more loudly and without fear of consequences. And finally, where both youth and gender factors intersect, young women and young girls face compounded vulnerabilities. In many cases, they are among the first to lose access to education, reproductive health services, and employment opportunities in times of crisis. And this is an issue that affects very severely our partners in Africa. Addressing polycrisis through gender and youth lens helps build resilience across communities, ensuring that the recovery efforts do not leave anyone behind. And this is something that we really have to keep in mind, especially those of us women who happen to come to some position where we can have a voice and our voices can be heard.
Thank you very much, Professor Papaioannou, for your answer, and especially thank you for giving so vivid examples of what those lenses might point to. Let me ask you at this final point, if there was just a single thing that a country could do for these polycrisis links between climate change and cultural heritage, in your view, what would that be?
Well, if there's one overarching action that could make the most impact, it is strengthening resilience through climate change action. And here's why. First, climate change exacerbates other crises. It intensifies food insecurity, water scarcity, migration, and economic instability, all of which feed into other global crises. Addressing climate change helps reduce the risks that cascade into those other areas. Invest in sustainability builds long-term resilience. By shifting towards renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, and circular economies, countries can create systems that are more resilient to shocks, economic, environmental, or otherwise. And finally, global leadership and collaboration is a strong desideratum. Climate action fosters international cooperation, which is essential to tackling the broader polycrisis. Building frameworks with a global identity in mind creates stronger political, economic, and social foundations. I believe, to wrap up, that focusing on climate action can serve as a linchpin for addressing multiple crises, making systems more adaptable and resilient to future shocks across many dimensions, and guaranteeing that we will have another 50 years or so to enjoy nowadays, and make sure that the crisis we're facing can still be manageable and give us the feeling that we still have a word over nature and we can somehow bring it to our side.
Thank you very much on our side, Professor Papaioannou, for your answer and for this very thought-provoking discussion, I would say, overall. It is much appreciated, and we gladly look forward to any opportunities to continue talking about those topics in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the PolyCIVIS podcast series. This podcast has been brought to you by the PolyCIVIS Jean Monnet Policy Network on confronting the polycrisis in Europe and Africa, policy and education, with the support of the CIVIS University Alliance. Please check us out at civis.eu/polycivis and do not forget to subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media. This podcast was recorded at the media studios of the Paris Lodron University of Salzburg.